The front door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet suburban street. My suitcase, hastily packed with whatever I could grab, lay at my feet as I stood on the porch of the house I'd called home for 8 years. My mother-in-law's venomous words still burned in my ears. "You're no longer welcome here. Sarah, take your lies and get out." It was a lie that had unraveled everything, a lie not of my making, but one I'd been forced to bear the weight of. My in-laws, Robert and Diane, had orchestrated a cruel charade, claiming they'd won $1 million in a lottery they never entered. They'd used the fabricated windfall to manipulate everyone around them, including me, their son's widow, into believing I was a burden they could no longer afford. But what they didn't know was that I'd uncovered their deception, and my revenge would leave them with nothing but the ashes of their own greed. The nightmare began 3 months ago, on a humid July evening. I was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Robert burst through the door, waving a piece of paper like it was a royal decree. "We're rich, Sarah," he bellowed, his voice thick with excitement. Diane followed, her eyes gleaming with a smug satisfaction I'd never seen before. $1 million. Can you believe it? We won the state lottery." I froze, the knife hovering over a carrot. My late husband, Mark, had been gone for 2 years, killed in a car accident that left me shattered and dependent on his parents' begrudging hospitality. They'd never hidden their resentment toward me, a childless widow who, in their eyes, contributed nothing but grief to their perfect family. The news of their sudden wealth felt like a lifeline. Maybe now they'd ease up, stop treating me like an intruder in their home. "We're moving up in the world," Diane said, her voice dripping with superiority. "New house, new cars, maybe even a yacht. You'll have to pull your weight now, Sarah. No more freeloading." Her words stung, but I nodded, swallowing my pride. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer, barely scraping by, but I promised to contribute more. They didn't care. To them, I was a leech, and their newfound fortune was a chance to tighten the screws. Over the next few weeks, their behavior grew unbearable. They flaunted their win at every opportunity, hosting lavish parties, buying designer clothes, and talking endlessly about their plans to move to a gated community. But something felt off. The lottery ticket they'd shown me was pristine, untouched, like it had been printed in their home office. And when I asked for details when the drawing happened, which store sold the ticket, they were vague, dismissive. Robert would snap, "Why do you care? It's our money." Diane would just smirk and change the subject. I started digging. It wasn't hard to notice the cracks in their story. The state lottery website listed no recent winners matching their claim. Local news hadn't reported a jackpot in months. I called the lottery commission, posing as a curious neighbor, and they confirmed no $1 million prize had been awarded that year. My in-laws were lying. But why? What did they gain from faking a windfall? The answer came one evening when I overheard them in their study. I'd been upstairs, working on a client project, when their voices drifted through the vent. "Once we kick her out, we can sell the house," Robert said, his tone cold and calculated. "The market's hot. We'll make a fortune, and no one will question it with the lottery story." Diane laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "She's so gullible. She'll be out by the end of the month, and we'll be free of her." My blood ran cold. They were using the fake lottery win as a pretext to evict me, to make it seem like they were moving on to a better life while I was left with nothing. They knew I had nowhere to go, no family to turn to. Mark had been my everything, and his death had left me adrift. But now, I wasn't just grieving, I was angry. If they thought they could destroy me with a lie, they were about to learn who they were dealing with. I spent the next week gathering evidence. I hacked into Robert's email. His password was his birthday, hardly a challenge, and found messages to a real estate agent about selling the house. I recorded their conversations through the vent, capturing every damning word. I even found the printer they'd used to create the fake lottery ticket, complete with a digital template on Robert's computer. They'd planned this meticulously, but they weren't as clever as they thought. The final straw came the day they kicked me out. Diane had cornered me in the living room, her face twisted with contempt. "You've been nothing but a burden since Mark died," she spat. "We're moving to our new mansion, and there's no room for you." Robert stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding like a judge passing sentence. "They handed me a check for $500 charity. They called it and told me to be gone by morning." I didn't argue. I packed my things, my hands shaking with rage, and walked out. But as I stood on that porch, the weight of their betrayal settled into resolve. They thought they'd won, that their lie had crushed me. They were wrong. I was going to expose them, dismantle their world, and make sure they felt every ounce of the humiliation they'd tried to inflict on me. The first step was finding an ally. I reached out to Emily, Mark's cousin, who'd always been kind to me. She'd distanced herself from Robert and Diane years ago, fed up with their manipulative ways. When I told her what they'd done, she was livid. "They're monsters," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Let's take them down." Emily had connections, a friend who worked at the local newspaper, another who was a private investigator. We met at a coffee shop, and I laid out everything: the fake lottery ticket, the recorded conversations, the emails about selling the house. The investigator, Tom, agreed to dig deeper. He traced the money Robert and Diane had been flashing around. It wasn't from a lottery, but from a shady loan they'd taken out against the house, using forged documents to inflate its value. "They're in debt up to their eyeballs," Tom said, sliding a folder across the table. "They're banking on selling the house to pay it off before anyone notices. The lottery story is just a cover to keep people from asking questions." I felt a surge of vindication. Their greed had made them sloppy, and now I had the ammunition I needed. Emily and I crafted a plan. We'd expose them publicly, but not before hitting them where it hurt most: their reputation. Robert and Diane thrived on their image as pillars of the community, churchgoers, charity donors, the perfect suburban couple. We'd strip that away, piece by piece, until they had nothing left to hide behind. Our first move was subtle but devastating. Emily's newspaper friend, Clara, agreed to run a story questioning the legitimacy of their lottery win. She didn't name them outright. Libel laws were tricky, but the article hinted at a local couple who'd been flaunting unverified wealth, urging readers to be wary of scams. The day it went live, I watched from a distance as Diane read it on her phone, her face paling. Robert stormed out of the house, yelling into his phone at some poor editor. The seed of doubt was planted. Next, we leaked the recorded conversations to a local gossip blog, anonymized but unmistakable. The voices were clearly Robert and Diane's, scheming to evict their widowed daughter-in-law for profit. The blog post went viral in our small town, shared by neighbors who'd long suspected the couple's holier-than-thou act was a facade. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers. "Did you hear about the Millers faking a lottery win to kick out their son's wife?" Disgusting. The pressure was mounting, but I wasn't done. Tom had uncovered more. Robert had been skimming funds from his accounting firm, using the fake lottery story to explain his sudden spending. I sent the evidence to his boss, who launched an internal investigation. Within days, Robert was suspended, his reputation in tatters. Diane's social circle abandoned her, canceling her from their book clubs and charity boards. They were unraveling, and I hadn't even played my final card. I moved into Emily's spare room, a cozy attic space that felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold, judgmental atmosphere of my in-laws' house. Every night, I pored over the evidence Tom had gathered, piecing together a timeline of their deception. The loan they'd taken out was fraudulent, secured with fake appraisals and forged signatures. They'd planned to sell the house, pay off the loan with the proceeds, and pocket the difference, all while hiding behind their lottery lie. It was a house of cards, and I was about to blow it down. Emily and I decided to escalate things. We contacted a lawyer, Rachel, who specialized in fraud cases. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, with a sharp mind and a passion for justice. When I showed her the evidence, the fake lottery ticket, the recorded conversations, the loan documents, she let out a low whistle. "This is a gold mine," she said. "They're looking at serious legal trouble, fraud, forgery, maybe even embezzlement if we tie this to Robert's accounting firm." Rachel suggested we file a civil lawsuit against Robert and Diane for emotional distress and financial manipulation. "It's not just about the money," she explained. "This will force them to face their lies in court, in front of everyone they've tried to impress." The thought of them squirming under oath, their secrets laid bare, sent a thrill through me. But we needed more leverage to make sure they couldn't wiggle out of it. Tom came through again. He'd tracked down the loan officer who'd approved their shady deal, a nervous man named Greg who worked at a local bank. Greg was reluctant to talk at first, but when Tom hinted that the authorities were sniffing around, he cracked. "They told me it was a sure thing," Greg admitted, his voice shaky. "Said they had $1 million payout coming and just needed a bridge loan. I didn't know the lottery win was fake." His confession was recorded, another nail in my in-laws' coffin. With Greg's statement, Rachel drafted the lawsuit. It accused Robert and Diane of fraudulently misrepresenting their financial status to manipulate and evict me, causing severe emotional and financial harm. The damages we sought weren't exorbitant, just enough to make them sweat, but the real goal was public exposure. Rachel filed the papers, and within days, the local courthouse was buzzing with the news. The Millers, once the toast of the town, were now the subject of a scandal that no one could ignore. The lawsuit hit them like a freight train. Diane called me, her voice trembling with rage and desperation. "How could you do this to us, Sarah? After everything we've done for you." I almost laughed at her audacity. "Everything you've done," I shot back. "You lied, schemed, and threw me out like trash. This is just the beginning." I hung up, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and triumph. For the first time since Mark's death, I felt in control. Meanwhile, the gossip blog kept the pressure on. They published a follow-up post, this time with anonymous tips from neighbors who'd seen Robert and Diane's lavish spending new cars, designer furniture, even a deposit on a vacation home that never materialized. The comments section was brutal, filled with people calling them frauds and liars. One commenter, who I suspected was Emily, wrote, "They thought they could fool everyone, but the truth always comes out." I smiled, knowing the worst was yet to come. Robert's suspension from his accounting firm turned into a full-blown investigation. His boss, a man named Mr. Thompson, was furious when he saw the evidence of Robert's financial misconduct. "He's been cooking the books for months," Thompson told Tom over the phone, "using client funds to cover his personal debts. He's done." Robert was fired the next day, his career in ruins. Diane's social standing took an even bigger hit when the church they attended asked her to step down from the charity committee, citing concerns about integrity. I watched their world collapse from the sidelines, but I wasn't gloating, not yet. There was a part of me that ached for the family I'd once hoped to belong to. Mark had loved his parents, flawed as they were, and I wondered what he'd think of me now, fighting their cruelty with calculated precision. But I pushed those thoughts aside. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about reclaiming my dignity from people who'd tried to strip it away. Our next move was bolder. Emily and I organized a community meeting, ostensibly to discuss financial scams in the neighborhood. We invited everyone, neighbors, church members, even the local business owners who'd been wowed by Robert and Diane's supposed wealth. Clara, the newspaper reporter, covered the event, framing it as a public service. I stood at the front of the room, my hands steady despite the nerves, and shared my story not as a victim, but as a survivor. I trusted them, I said, my voice clear and strong. They were my family, and they betrayed me with a lie. But I'm not here to tear them down. I'm here to warn you, so no one else falls for their schemes. The room was silent, the weight of my words sinking in. I didn't name Robert and Diane directly, but everyone knew who I was talking about. By the end of the night, their reputation was in tatters, and the community they'd once lorded over had turned its back on them. As I left the meeting, I caught sight of Diane in the parking lot, watching from her car. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. For a moment, I felt a pang of pity, but it vanished when I remembered her cruel words, her smug satisfaction as she handed me that $500 check. She'd made her choice, and now she was living with the consequences. Rachel called me the next morning with news. Robert and Diane had hired a lawyer, but their case was weak. They're scrambling, she said. The evidence is overwhelming, and the public backlash is making it worse. They'll either settle or face a trial that'll ruin them completely. I nodded, my mind already racing toward the final piece of my plan. I wanted them to face the truth in court, to admit what they'd done. But more than that, I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, to understand that their greed had cost them everything. Rachel had warned me that the legal battle would be grueling, but I was ready. The evidence we'd gathered was airtight: the fake lottery ticket, the recorded conversations, the fraudulent loan documents, and Greg's testimony. Robert and Diane's lawyer, a slick man named Harold, tried to paint them as victims of a misunderstanding, but the judge wasn't buying it. The discovery phase alone was a disaster for them, with their financial records laid bare, revealing a web of lies and debt. In the weeks leading up to the trial, I kept a low profile, staying with Emily and working on my freelance projects to rebuild my savings. The community's reaction to the scandal was overwhelming. People stopped me in the street to offer support, some even sharing their own stories of Robert and Diane's manipulative behavior. It was bittersweet, knowing I wasn't alone, but also realizing how many others they'd hurt over the years. Emily and I continued our campaign, feeding tidbits to Clara for follow-up articles. One piece detailed how Robert had used his position at the accounting firm to funnel money into personal accounts, a revelation that prompted several clients to sue him. Another article exposed Diane's role in forging documents, painting her as the mastermind behind the fake lottery scheme. The headlines were relentless, and with each one, their social standing eroded further. One evening, as I scrolled through the gossip blog's latest post, I saw a comment that stopped me cold. I knew they were shady when they tried to borrow money from me, claiming they'd pay it back with their lottery winnings. Liars. It was from a woman named Linda, a former friend of Diane's. I reached out to her, and she confirmed that Diane had approached her months ago, spinning the same lottery story to secure a loan she never repaid. Linda's testimony was another weapon in our arsenal, and Rachel added her to the witness list. The trial began on a crisp October morning. The courtroom was packed: neighbors, former colleagues, even a few reporters. Robert and Diane sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I'd ever seen them. Robert's face was gaunt, his suit ill-fitting, as if he'd lost weight from the stress. Diane's eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. I sat with Emily and Rachel, my heart pounding but my resolve unshaken. Rachel's opening statement was a masterpiece. She painted a vivid picture of a grieving widow betrayed by her in-laws, manipulated by a fabricated lottery when designed to evict her and fund their greed. This isn't just about money, she told the jury. It's about trust, family, and the deliberate harm inflicted on someone who had already lost so much. I saw jurors nodding, their faces softening with sympathy. When I took the stand, I told my story with unflinching honesty. I described the pain of losing Mark, the humiliation of being treated like a burden, and the shock of discovering their lie. I held up the fake lottery ticket, my voice steady as I explained how I'd uncovered their scheme. They thought I was weak, I said, looking directly at Robert and Diane. But they underestimated me. Their lawyer tried to trip me up on cross-examination, suggesting I'd fabricated evidence out of spite. But Rachel had prepared me well, and I countered every question with calm precision, letting the evidence speak for itself. By the time I stepped down, the jury's eyes were on Robert and Diane, not me. Greg's testimony was the turning point. He admitted to approving the loan based on their false claims, his voice cracking as he described the pressure Robert had put him under. "I trusted them," he said, echoing my own words. The jury's faces hardened, and I knew we'd struck a chord. Robert took the stand next, and it was a disaster. He stammered through his defense, claiming the lottery ticket was a misunderstanding and that he'd never intended to hurt me. But Rachel tore him apart on cross-examination, presenting the forged documents and emails that contradicted his story. He crumbled, his lies exposed under the courtroom's harsh lights. Diane refused to testify, her lawyer citing emotional distress. It was a weak move, and the jury saw through it. By the end of the first week, the tide had turned decisively in our favor. Rachel leaned over during a recess and whispered, "We've got them." I nodded, but the victory felt hollow. I wanted justice, not just for me, but for Mark, whose memory they'd tarnished with their greed. Outside the courtroom, the community continued to turn on them. Their house was listed for sale, but no one was buying. Word had spread about the fraudulent loan, and potential buyers were wary. Their cars were repossessed, their bank accounts frozen pending the lawsuit's outcome. Diane was spotted at the grocery store, paying with coins because her credit cards had been declined. Robert stopped leaving the house altogether, unable to face the neighbors' stares. Emily and I didn't let up. We organized a second community meeting, this time focused on financial literacy and spotting scams. I shared my story again, but this time, I emphasized healing and resilience. They tried to break me, I told the crowd, but I'm still standing. And so can you. The applause was deafening, and for the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming my place in the world. As the trial neared its end, Rachel presented our final piece of evidence, a forensic accountant's report detailing Robert's embezzlement from his firm. It was the knockout blow. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts. We were awarded damages, not a fortune, but enough to cover my losses and send a message. More importantly, the judge ordered Robert and Diane to pay restitution to the bank and Robert's former clients, a sum that would cripple them financially. I walked out of the courtroom feeling lighter than I had in years. Emily hugged me, tears in her eyes. "Mark would be proud of you," she said. I smiled, hoping she was right. But the fight wasn't over. There was one final act of revenge, one that would ensure Robert and Diane never forgot the cost of their lies. The judge's ruling had left Robert and Diane financially ruined, but their arrogance lingered. I heard through the grapevine that they were telling anyone who'd listen that they'd been wronged, that I was a vindictive liar who'd fabricated the whole scandal. Their refusal to take responsibility only fueled my determination to deliver the final blow. Rachel suggested we go after their remaining assets. The house, their last major holding, was still on the market, but its value was plummeting due to the scandal. "If we can tie it to the fraudulent loan," she said, "the bank could seize it outright." Tom, the private investigator, had one last trick up his sleeve. He'd found a paper trail linking the house's mortgage to Robert's embezzlement. The bank, eager to recoup its losses, agreed to pursue foreclosure. I didn't want the house for myself. Too many painful memories lingered in its walls, but I wanted Robert and Diane to lose the one thing they'd clung to as a symbol of their success. The foreclosure process was swift. Within weeks, a "for sale by bank" sign stood in their front yard, a public marker of their downfall. Neighbors gawked, and the gossip blog posted photos, captioning them, "From millionaires to broke, the Miller's house of lies collapses." But my plan went beyond financial ruin. I wanted them to face the community they'd deceived. Emily and I worked with Clara to organize a public forum, framed as a town hall on trust and accountability. We invited everyone: church members, business owners, even the few friends Robert and Diane had left. The event was held in the community center, a place where Diane had once reigned as the queen of charity events. I stood at the podium, my heart steady despite the sea of faces watching me. "This isn't about revenge," I began, my voice carrying through the room. "It's about truth. For too long, people like Robert and Diane Miller have used lies to manipulate and control. I'm here to tell you that no one is above accountability, not even family." I shared the full story, from the fake lottery ticket to the fraudulent loan, laying out the evidence for all to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd as I played snippets of the recorded conversations, their voices unmistakable. Then came the surprise. I'd invited Linda, the woman Diane had tried to scam, to speak. She took the stage, her voice trembling but resolute. They came to me with their fake lottery story, asking for money they never intended to repay. She said, "I trusted them, and they betrayed me, just like they betrayed Sarah." Other voices followed: former clients of Robert's, neighbors who'd been pressured into shady investments, even a pastor who admitted he'd been suspicious of their sudden generosity at church. The room was electric with outrage. Robert and Diane didn't show up, but I knew they'd hear about it. The next day, Clara's newspaper ran a front-page story titled "The Fall of the Millers, a Town Betrayed." It was picked up by regional outlets, ensuring their shame followed them wherever they went. Their social media accounts, once filled with photos of their lavish lifestyle, went silent. Friends reported that Diane had stopped answering calls, and Robert was rarely seen outside. With their house gone and their reputation in tatters, I turned my focus to rebuilding my own life. I used the lawsuit damages to rent a small apartment, a cozy space where I could start fresh. My freelance business was picking up, thanks to referrals from Emily and Clara, who'd become my biggest cheerleaders. For the first time since Mark's death, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that I could create a future on my own terms. But there was one loose end. The community still saw me as the grieving widow, the victim of my in-laws' cruelty. I wanted to change that narrative, to show them I was more than my pain. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching free graphic design workshops for local kids. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a way to give back, to build something positive from the ashes of my ordeal. One evening, as I was packing up after a workshop, a woman approached me. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "My daughter was scammed by someone like your in-laws. Your story gave her the courage to speak out." I felt a lump in my throat. This was why I'd fought, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been silenced by greed and manipulation. As winter approached, Robert and Diane's downfall was complete. The bank seized their house, and they moved into a cramped rental on the edge of town. Robert's accounting license was revoked, and Diane was shunned by the social circles she'd once dominated. They were shadows of their former selves, their lies exposed, their legacy destroyed. But I wasn't done healing. I visited Mark's grave, something I hadn't done since the ordeal began. I sat by his headstone, the cold grass beneath me, and told him everything. "I fought for us," I whispered. "I hope you're proud." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I felt his presence, warm and steady, like he was telling me to keep going. Emily threw a small party to celebrate the end of the trial, inviting Clara, Tom, Rachel, and a few neighbors who'd supported me. We laughed, ate, and toasted to new beginnings. As I looked around the room, I realized I'd found a new family, not one bound by blood, but by loyalty and love. Robert and Diane had tried to break me, but they'd only made me stronger. The final piece of my revenge came quietly, almost poetically. I learned through Tom that Robert and Diane had applied for a loan to start over, only to be rejected when the bank ran their credit. The reason? A fraud alert I'd placed on their names, using the court's ruling as evidence. They'd never escape the shadow of their lies. Not as long as I had a say. Spring arrived, painting the town in soft greens and pinks, a stark contrast to the storm I'd weathered. My apartment was starting to feel like home, with colorful prints on the walls and a desk where my freelance work thrived. But the scars of my in-laws' betrayal lingered, not as wounds, but as reminders of what I'd overcome. I wanted to channel that strength into something bigger, something that would prevent anyone else from falling victim to scams like theirs. I teamed up with Clara to launch a community initiative called Truth and Trust. It was a series of workshops and resources aimed at educating people about financial scams, from fake lotteries to predatory loans. I poured my heart into it, drawing on my experience to create materials that were clear, relatable, and empowering. Emily helped with outreach, and Rachel offered pro bono legal advice for victims of fraud. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people signed up for the first session, many sharing their own stories of betrayal. At the first workshop, I stood before a diverse crowd: young couples, retirees, single parents, all eager to learn how to protect themselves. I shared my story, not shying away from the pain, but emphasizing the power of resilience. They thought they could silence me. I said, my voice steady. But every lie they told gave me a reason to speak louder. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a surge of pride, not just for myself, but for the community we were building. The initiative gained traction, with local businesses sponsoring our events and the newspaper covering our progress. Clara wrote a feature titled From Victim to Victor: How One Woman Turned Betrayal into Empowerment. The article included a photo of me at the community center, surrounded by workshop participants, all of us smiling. It was a stark contrast to the image of me standing on Robert and Diane's porch, suitcase in hand, feeling like the world had ended. Meanwhile, Robert and Diane's lives continued to unravel. Tom kept tabs on them, reporting that they'd tried to move to another town, only to be recognized from the news coverage. Their new neighbors shunned them, and their landlord raised the rent after learning about their fraud conviction. Diane's attempts to rebuild her socialite image failed miserably. She was turned away from a nearby church's volunteer program, the pastor citing her history of deceit. Robert, desperate for work, applied for low-level bookkeeping jobs, but no one would hire him with his record. I heard he'd taken a part-time gig at a gas station, a far cry from the prestigious accounting career he'd once flaunted. Their downfall was complete, but it wasn't enough for me to know they were suffering. I wanted them to understand why. I decided to confront them one last time, not in anger, but with the calm certainty of someone who'd reclaimed their power. I drove to their rental, a rundown duplex that smelled of mildew and neglect. Diane answered the door, her face haggard, her eyes dull with defeat. Robert stood behind her, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in months. Sarah, Diane said, her voice flat. What do you want? There was no venom left, just exhaustion. I want you to know what you've lost, I said, standing tall. Not just your money or your house, but the trust of everyone who ever cared about you. You tried to destroy me, but you only destroyed yourselves. I handed them a copy of Clara's latest article, the one about truth and trust. This is what I'm doing with the pain you caused. I'm building something better. Robert stared at the article, his hands trembling. Diane's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. I turned and walked away, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. That moment wasn't about gloating, it was about closure. They'd never apologize, but their silence was enough. Back at the community center, Truth and Trust was thriving. We expanded to include online webinars, reaching people beyond our town. I started a blog, sharing tips on spotting scams and stories of others who'd fought back against fraud. The comments section became a space for survivors to connect, a virtual community of resilience. One woman wrote, "Your story saved me from signing a bad loan. Thank you for being our voice." I cried reading it, not out of sadness, but gratitude. Emily and I celebrated the initiative's 6-month anniversary with a fundraiser. The event was a success, raising enough to fund free legal clinics for scam victims. Rachel spoke, praising the community's strength and my role in sparking change. Sarah didn't just fight for herself. She said, she fought for all of us. I blushed and used to the praise, but I couldn't deny the truth in her words. As the months passed, I heard less and less about Robert and Diane. They'd become pariahs, their names synonymous with deceit. The last I heard, they'd moved to a trailer park in another state, scraping by on odd jobs. I didn't wish them harm, but I felt no pity either. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. My freelance business was booming, and I was saving for a small house of my own. I'd started dating again, a kind man named David who worked at the community center. He wasn't Mark, but he made me laugh, and that was enough for now. Life was moving forward, and I was no longer defined by my in-laws' betrayal. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, I opened a box of Mark's things I'd kept in storage. Inside was a letter he'd written to me before we married, promising to always stand by me. "You're stronger than you know," he'd written. I smiled through tears, realizing he'd been right all along. I'd faced the worst and come out stronger, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd been hurt by lies like Robert and Diane's. The legacy of truth and trust grew, and so did I. The pain of betrayal had forged me into someone who didn't just survive, but thrived, turning darkness into light. The success of truth and trust was undeniable. By summer, we'd partnered with a regional nonprofit to expand our workshops, and I was invited to speak at a state conference on financial literacy. Standing before hundreds of people, I shared my story with a confidence I'd never known. Scams don't just steal money, I told the crowd. They steal trust, hope, and dignity. But we can take those back by standing together. The standing ovation felt like a validation of everything I'd fought for. Back home, the community continued to rally around me. The kids from my graphic design workshops started calling me Miss Sarah, their enthusiasm a bright spot in my days. One girl, Mia, drew me a picture of a superhero with my face, captioned "The Truth Teller." I hung it on my fridge, a reminder of the impact I was making. But not everyone was supportive. A few of Robert and Diane's old allies, mostly distant relatives, tried to stir up trouble, spreading rumors that I'd exaggerated the scandal for attention. Their efforts fell flat. The evidence was too strong, and the community had seen the truth. Still, it reminded me that healing wasn't linear. There would always be voices trying to pull me back into the shadows. I decided to write a memoir, not just to tell my story, but to inspire others. I called it From Lies to Light, a journey through betrayal. Writing it was cathartic, each chapter a step toward letting go of the anger that had once consumed me. I described the moment I was kicked out, the pain of discovering their lie, and the triumph of exposing them. But I also wrote about Mark, his kindness, his laughter, the way he believed in me. The memoir wasn't just about revenge. It was about love, loss, and rebuilding. Clara connected me with a small publisher, and the book was picked up for release the following year. When I signed the contract, I felt a rush of pride. This was my story, told on my terms, and no one could take that away. I dedicated the book to Mark, with a simple note: "For you, who taught me strength." Meanwhile, Robert and Diane's lives continued to spiral. Tom heard they'd tried to sue the bank over the foreclosure, claiming they'd been unfairly targeted. The case was thrown out in days, the judge citing their fraud conviction as reason enough. Their trailer park neighbors complained about their constant arguments, and word got around that Diane had started drinking heavily. Robert was spotted at a pawn shop, selling off what little they had left. Their pride, once their defining trait, was gone. I didn't seek them out, but fate had other plans. One afternoon, while shopping for art supplies, I ran into Diane at the store. She looked frail, her designer clothes replaced by a faded sweater. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I thought she'd lash out. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry, Sarah." It was the first time she'd ever apologized, and it caught me off guard. I studied her, searching for sincerity. "I hope you mean that," I said softly. "But apologies don't undo what you did. You have to live with that." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, and walked away. I didn't feel triumph, just a quiet acceptance. Her regret was her burden now, not mine. The memoir's release was a turning point. It sold modestly but resonated deeply, with readers sending me letters about how it had inspired them to confront their own betrayals. One woman wrote, "Your courage gave me the strength to leave a toxic relationship. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone." Each letter was a reminder that my pain had become a beacon for others. Truth and Trust expanded further, with plans for a statewide campaign. I hired a small team, including Mia's mom, who'd become a friend. We secured a grant to create a mobile app for reporting scams, making it easier for victims to seek help. The app's launch was covered by local news, and I was interviewed alongside Emily and Rachel, our faces beaming with pride. David, my new partner, was a steady presence through it all. He didn't try to fix me or erase my past. He simply walked beside me, offering quiet support. One night, as we sat on my balcony watching the stars, he said, "You've turned something awful into something beautiful." I squeezed his hand, grateful for his belief in me. As the one-year anniversary of the trial approached, I organized a community event to celebrate truth and trust's impact. We held it in the park, with live music, food trucks, and booths for financial education. Hundreds attended, including many who'd been at my first town hall. I spoke briefly, thanking them for their support. "This isn't just my victory," I said. "It's ours. Together, we've shown that truth always wins." After the event, Emily pulled me aside. "You did it, Sarah. You didn't just take them down, you built something better." I hugged her, tears prickling my eyes. She was right. Robert and Diane's lies had been a catalyst, but I'd chosen what to do with the pain. I'd chosen to create, to heal, to rise. That night, I dreamed of Mark. He was smiling, his hand on my shoulder. "You're unstoppable," he said. I woke with a sense of peace, knowing I'd honored his memory by refusing to let his parents' betrayal define me. The release of From Lies to Light marked a new chapter. The book tour took me to small bookstores and community centers across the state, where I met people who saw themselves in my story. A young man in one audience shared how he'd escaped a fraudulent business deal, inspired by my memoir. A grandmother told me she'd taught her grandchildren to question too good to be true promises. Each encounter reinforced my purpose, to turn pain into power, not just for myself, but for anyone who'd been deceived. Truth and Trust was now a recognized name, with partnerships extending to national organizations. We launched a hotline for scam victims, staffed by volunteers trained by Rachel. The app we developed was downloaded thousands of times, its user-friendly interface helping people report fraud and access resources. I was no longer just Sarah, the widow who'd been wronged. I was Sarah, the advocate, the survivor, the voice for those who'd been silenced. Robert and Diane faded further into obscurity. Tom's last update was that they'd split up, unable to bear the weight of their shared failure. Diane had moved in with a distant cousin, while Robert was living in a cheap motel, working odd jobs. Their names no longer carried weight in our town. They were a cautionary tale, a footnote in the community's history. I didn't seek them out again. Their apology, if it was genuine, was their problem to carry. I'd moved on. My relationship with David grew stronger. He proposed on a quiet evening, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple question as we walked through the park. "Will you build a life with me?" he asked, his eyes warm and steady. I said yes, not because I needed someone to save me, but because I wanted a partner to share the life I'd reclaimed. We planned a small wedding, with Emily as my maid of honor and Clara and Rachel among the guests. The community center became my second home. I expanded my graphic design workshops, adding a mentorship program for teens interested in creative careers. Mia, now a regular, designed a logo for truth and trust, her talent shining through. Watching her grow reminded me of the girl I'd been before life's hardships full of dreams, unafraid to chase them. I wanted to give her and others the chance I'd almost lost. One day, I received a letter from a reader in another state. She'd been scammed by her own family, losing her savings to a fake investment scheme. Your book showed me I could fight back, she wrote. I reported them, and I'm starting over. Thank you for giving me hope. I kept her letter on my desk, a reminder of why I kept going. As the second anniversary of the trial approached, I organized a gala for truth and trust, a celebration of our impact. The event was held in a beautifully decorated hall, with speeches from scam survivors and performances by local artists. I took the stage last, my voice steady but emotional. 2 years ago, I was standing on a porch, my life in pieces. I said, today, I'm standing here because of all of you, because we chose truth over lies, community over greed. The crowd rose to their feet, their applause a wave of warmth. Emily hugged me afterward, whispering, "You've changed lives, Sarah." I smiled, thinking of Mark, of the strength he'd always seen in me. This was his legacy too, carried forward through my fight. After the gala, I walked home with David, the night air cool against my skin. We talked about our Futuria house, maybe a family, but above all, a life built on honesty and love. I realized I no longer carried the weight of Robert and Diane's betrayal. It had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was free. The final piece of my journey came unexpectedly. A lawyer contacted me, saying Robert had passed away a heart attack, likely from the stress of his ruined life. Diane had reached out through him, asking if I'd meet her. I agreed, not out of obligation, but curiosity. We met at a diner, her face etched with grief and regret. I was wrong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I let greed destroy everything. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to say it. I looked at her, seeing not the woman who'd hurt me, but a broken person, alone with her choices. I hope you find peace, I said, meaning it. But that's your journey now, not mine. I walked away, the diner's neon lights fading behind me. The pain of the past was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. I'd taken Robert and Diane's lies and turned them into a movement, a community, a life I was proud of. Their silence was their defeat. My voice was my victory. As I stepped into my apartment, David waiting with a smile, I knew I'd done more than survive. I'd thrived, turning betrayal into a beacon of hope. And that was a revenge sweeter than any destruction, a legacy of light that would outshine their darkness forever.